They never said it directly, not at first. No one ever does. Rejection rarely comes with clear words. It comes in looks that linger a second too long, in conversations that stop when you enter the room, in chairs that are always mysteriously taken when you arrive. From the day I married into my husband's family, I felt it. I was tolerated, not welcomed, accepted on paper, but never in spirit. At family gatherings, I learned where to stand so I wouldn't be in anyone's way. I learned to smile without expecting one back. I learned to bring dishes no one would compliment and gifts no one would use. I learned slowly and painfully that love could exist without respect, and that sometimes even marriage doesn't earn you a place. My husband, Daniel, saw it. Of course he did. But seeing and confronting are two different things. He would squeeze my hand under the table when his mother corrected my words or dismissed my opinion. He would change the subject when his sister made those small, sharp comments disguised as jokes. "That's just how they are," he'd whisper later. "They don't mean it." I wanted to believe him. So I did. The house where his family gathered every Sunday was large and warm, filled with the smell of roasted meat and polished wood. It looked like the kind of place where everyone belonged, everyone except me. I always felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome even after years of marriage. The walls were covered in framed photos, birthdays, graduations, holidays, moments I was rarely part of. Even when I was there, I was often cropped out or standing at the edge, half visible. His mother, Eleanor, had a way of smiling without warmth. Her voice was polite, controlled, almost kind, but her eyes never softened when she looked at me. She asked about my job without listening to the answer. She praised Daniel for things we had accomplished together, and she never missed an opportunity to remind me, subtly, that I came from a different background. Different was her favorite word. Different values, different upbringing, different expectations. I tried harder than I should have. I dressed the way she liked. I learned her recipes. I memorized birthdays. I showed up early and stayed late. I swallowed my pride and apologized for things I didn't do just to keep the peace. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking myself why peace always required my silence. Daniel was my anchor. When it was just us, life felt normal, warm, safe. He told me he loved me, and I never doubted that. But love, I learned, doesn't always protect you from loneliness. Sometimes it coexists with it. Years passed like this. Not terrible enough to leave, not kind enough to feel whole. And then, without warning, everything stopped. Daniel died on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that feels ordinary until it fractures your life into before and after. A heart attack, sudden, no time for goodbyes, no time for explanations. One moment he was there, the next. He was a memory everyone spoke about in the past tense. Grief is strange. It sharpens some moments and blurs others. I remember the hospital hallway, too bright and too quiet. I remember holding his jacket, still warm, as if that warmth meant something. I remember Eleanor's face when she saw me, not cruel, not kind, just distant, as if my grief was adjacent to theirs, but not quite the same. After the funeral, the rejection didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. Without Daniel there, I no longer had a buffer. Conversations about inheritance happened without me. Decisions were made in rooms I wasn't invited into. I became Daniel's wife in the past tense, a footnote in a family history that was already rewriting itself. I considered leaving town, starting over somewhere no one knew me as the woman who never quite fit. But something kept me there. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was unfinished grief. Or maybe it was the quiet sense that there was more to Daniel than even I knew. It was Eleanor who called me one evening, her voice unusually stiff. "We're cleaning out Daniel's things," she said. "You should come. There are matters to sort through." I knew what that meant. Papers, objects, the dismantling of a life into boxes and decisions. I braced myself and went. Daniel's childhood room hadn't changed much. Same desk, same bookshelf, same faint smell of old paper and dust. It felt like stepping into a paused version of him, one I had never fully known. Eleanor stood near the doorway, arms crossed, watching me carefully, as if I might take something that wasn't mine. I began opening drawers slowly, respectfully, old notebooks, ticket stubs, letters from college friends, pieces of a life before me. Then, tucked inside the back of a book, I found something that didn't belong with the rest, an envelope. Yellowed with age, my name written on it in Daniel's handwriting. My heart stopped. I looked up at Eleanor, unsure whether to say anything. She hadn't noticed yet. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. My hands shook as I slid the envelope out. It was sealed, dated 20 years earlier, long before Daniel and I were married, long before his family decided who I was. I didn't open it right away. Some part of me knew that once I did, nothing would be the same. I slipped the envelope into my bag without a word. That night, alone in my quiet apartment, I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of me. I traced my name with my finger, the familiar curves of his handwriting bringing fresh tears. Daniel had hidden this. He didn't waste words. Daniel never did. He wrote as if he were speaking to me quietly, the way he used to late at night when the world felt too loud. He began by apologizing, not for dying, that came later, but for hiding this from me. He wrote that he had planned to give me the letter one day, when the time was right, when he was strong enough to face what it would change. That day, he admitted, never came. Fear had outlasted courage. As I read, I felt a strange mix of comfort and unease. Comfort, because his voice was there on the page, steady and familiar. Unease, because people don't hide things for 20 years unless they matter, unless they have consequences. Daniel wrote about his family, not with bitterness, but with honesty I hadn't heard from him before. He said they were proud people, deeply concerned with appearances and lineage. He said they believed love should follow rules, not challenge them. And then, in a line that made my chest tighten, he wrote that bringing me into their world had been both the bravest and most selfish thing he had ever done. I paused there, letting the words sink in. Bravest, I understood, but selfish? He explained that when he fell in love with me, he already knew something I didn't, something that would one day place me at the center of a conflict I hadn't agreed to. He wrote that he believed foolishly that time would soften things, that once they saw who I truly was, the truth he carried would matter less than the life we built together. He was wrong about that part. Daniel revealed that 20 years ago, before we met, there had been a rupture in his family, a secret dispute involving money, loyalty, and a decision made by his father that fractured relationships beyond repair. Daniel had taken a side quietly, firmly, and that choice had shaped how his family viewed trust ever since. He wrote that by marrying me, someone outside their carefully guarded circle, he had unknowingly reopened wounds they had never allowed to heal. I remembered moments that suddenly made sense. The tension when finances were discussed, the way his mother stiffened whenever my opinions touched on independence or fairness, the subtle suspicion that followed me, even when I had done nothing to earn it. I hadn't been judged only for who I was, but for what I represented. Daniel wrote that his family believed I had influenced him, changed him, pulled him away from them. The truth, he said, was the opposite. I had simply loved the version of him they refused to see. My eyes burned as I read that line. Then the letter shifted. The tone grew heavier. Daniel confessed that there was something tangible, something real, that tied him to the old conflict, something his family believed was lost forever. He wrote that he had found it years ago, hidden among documents his father had left behind. And instead of telling anyone, he had hidden it again. This time, for me, I felt my breath catch. Found what? He didn't name outright, not yet. He wrote instead about why he hid it, about how revealing it would force his family to confront their own choices, how it would challenge the narrative they had clung to for decades. He feared it would destroy whatever fragile piece remained. And selfishly, he wanted to protect me from becoming collateral damage in a war that had started long before I entered the picture. As I read, grief sharpened into something else, understanding maybe, or regret. I thought of every time Daniel had gone quiet when family conversations turned sharp, every time he had chosen silence over confrontation. He hadn't been weak. He had been carrying weight alone. The letter ended with instructions, simple ones. He wrote that if I was reading this, it meant he was gone and his family still hadn't accepted me. That hurt more than I expected. He had known. Somewhere deep down, he had known how this would end. He told me where to look. A place I had never considered important. A place so ordinary it had escaped attention for years. He told me to decide for myself what to do once I found it. To reveal the truth or let it stay buried. He promised he would understand either choice. I sat back in my chair, the letter slipping from my fingers onto the table. The apartment felt unbearably quiet. I realized I was shaking, not just from grief, but from the weight of responsibility he had placed in my hands. Daniel hadn't just left me his love, he had left me a choice. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his handwriting, heard his voice, felt the pull between loyalty and truth. I wondered if opening this door would finally earn me a place in his family, or sever the last threads connecting us. The next morning, I stood in front of the place Daniel had mentioned. It looked harmless, almost forgettable. If I hadn't read the letter, I would have walked past it without a second thought. My heart pounded as I reached for it, half expecting someone to stop me, to say I didn't belong here. No one did. Inside, I found exactly what Daniel had promised. Proof, undeniable, carefully preserved, waiting for the right moment, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to use it. I closed my eyes and took a long breath. Daniel had hidden this for 20 years. The question now was whether I was ready to uncover it. I didn't take the proof out right away. I just stood there, staring at it, as if looking too closely might change what it was. The object itself was ordinary, the kind of thing you could pass every day without giving it a second thought. But now that I knew what it represented, it felt heavy, like it carried not just paper and ink, but years of silence, resentment, and carefully maintained lies. I took it home and placed it on the table beside Daniel's letter. I needed time to think. Daniel had always been methodical. If he'd hidden this for 2 decades, there was a reason. And if he'd trusted me with it now, there was responsibility in that trust. I wasn't just dealing with a family secret. I was holding the key to a version of the past his family had chosen to forget. The proof told a story very different from the one I'd heard over the years. It explained why certain names were never spoken, why Daniel's father was remembered in fragments, never fully praised or condemned, why money had always been such a loaded topic, wrapped in politeness but edged with tension. This wasn't just about inheritance. It was about blame, about who had been allowed to walk away clean and who had quietly taken the fall. As I read through the documents, memories rearranged themselves in my mind. Comments that once felt petty now seemed defensive. Eleanor's constant need to control narrative suddenly looked less like pride and more like fear. Fear of exposure, fear of losing the version of the family she had worked so hard to present to the world. I realized then that my rejection hadn't been personal. It had been strategic. As long as I remained on the outside, they didn't have to worry about me seeing too much, understanding too much, asking the wrong questions. That realization didn't make the hurt disappear, but it did change its shape. It wasn't a flaw in me that kept me at a distance. It was proximity to truth. A few days later, Eleanor called again. Her tone was polite, but there was urgency beneath it. She wanted to discuss logistics, Daniel's belongings, legal matters, future arrangements. She suggested we meet at the house, all of us together. The invitation wasn't warm, but it was deliberate. I knew then that the moment was approaching, whether I wanted it or not. I arrived early. The house felt different without Daniel's presence, like a stage after the actors have left. Eleanor was already there, sitting upright in her usual chair, hands folded neatly in her lap. Daniel's sister, Margaret, stood near the window, arms crossed, her expression guarded. Others trickled in slowly, exchanging quiet greetings, careful not to look at me for too long. No one mentioned the letter. No one mentioned the past. We spoke in safe phrases about schedules and responsibilities, about moving forward. It was all very orderly, very controlled. Then Eleanor cleared her throat and turned to me. "We should discuss what happens next," she said, "as a family." The word family hung in the air hollow. I felt Daniel's presence then, not as memory, but as resolve. I reached into my bag and placed the documents on the table between us. The sound they made, soft, final, cut through the room. Every conversation stopped. Eleanor's eyes flicked down, then back up to my face. For a moment, her composure slipped. Just a crack, enough for me to see recognition. Margaret leaned forward, confusion giving way to suspicion. "I found these among Daniel's things," I said quietly. I didn't accuse, I didn't explain. I let the silence do the work. One by one, they reached Foe. "Are the papers?" The room filled with the sound of pages turning, breaths catching, chairs shifting. Faces changed, some hardened, some drained of color. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. Her voice was steady but strained. "This is old business," she said. "Things were complicated." "Complicated," I repeated, not unkindly, but not misunderstood. She looked at me sharply then, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. Not as Daniel's wife, not as an inconvenience, but as someone who knew. Daniel's sister stood abruptly, pacing the room. "Why didn't we know about this?" she demanded. "Why was this hidden?" I thought of Daniel's letter, of fear outlasting courage, because knowing would have required accountability, I said, and someone decided it was easier not to. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. Years of carefully maintained order were unraveling thread by thread. No one could pretend anymore. The past had arrived, uninvited and undeniable. Eleanor's voice softened. "Daniel shouldn't have involved you," she said. "This wasn't your burden." I met her gaze steadily. "He involved me because I was the only one he trusted to handle it honestly." That landed harder than I expected. Eleanor looked away. What followed wasn't shouting or dramatic confessions. It was quieter than that, harder. Pieces of truth surfaced slowly, reluctantly, admissions framed as explanations, justifications offered too late to matter. The family's image, so carefully polished, showed its cracks. By the time the meeting ended, nothing had been resolved, but nothing could be ignored anymore either. I gathered my things and stood to leave. Eleanor stopped me at the door. "You don't understand what you've done," she said. "I understand exactly what I've done," I replied. "I stopped pretending." Outside, the air felt lighter. I didn't know what would come next. Acceptance, distance, conflict. But for the first time, the outcome wasn't being decided without me. Daniel had hidden the truth to protect me. Now that it was out, I realized something important. The family hadn't rejected me because I didn't belong. They rejected me because all along I did. The days after that meeting passed in a strange haze. Nothing exploded outward, but everything shifted inward. Calls stopped coming. Messages went unanswered. The family group chat, once active with updates and carefully curated warmth, went silent. It was as if everyone needed time to decide which version of reality they were willing to live with now that the old one had cracked. I expected anger. I expected confrontation. What I hadn't expected was avoidance. Eleanor didn't call again. Neither did Margaret. The family house remained closed to me, not with hostility, but with something colder, recalibration. They were regrouping, deciding how to proceed now that the power balance had changed. I could feel it, the way you feel pressure before a storm. Inch. Quiet, I reread Daniel's letter again and again. Each time, new lines stood out. Words I had skimmed over now felt deliberate. He hadn't just hidden the truth. He had prepared for this moment, prepared for the possibility that one day I would have to stand alone against the family he loved but no longer trusted. I started noticing small things differently. How often Daniel had insisted we keep our own finances separate from his family's. How he had encouraged me to keep copies of important documents. How he'd always said, "Promise me you'll never doubt your instincts." At the time, I thought he was just being practical. Now I knew he was being protective. A week later, the first crack appeared. Margaret showed up at my door unannounced. She looked tired, less polished than usual. Her confidence had always come from certainty, from believing she knew where she stood. That certainty was gone now. She stood there awkwardly, hands clasped, eyes darting around my apartment as if she'd never really seen it before. "I didn't know," she said before I could even invite her in. I gestured for her to sit. She didn't. "I mean it," she continued. "I really didn't know about the documents, about what our father did." Her voice dropped on the last word. "Daniel never told me." I believed her, or at least I believe she believed herself. "He didn't tell me either," I said. "Not until now." Margaret swallowed. "Mom is furious. Not at you, at him." She hesitated. At herself too, I think, but she doesn't know how to admit that. I almost laughed at that. Almost. Margaret paced the room, then stopped. "You have to understand," she said. "Everything we were taught growing up was about loyalty, about protecting the family name. Admitting this would mean admitting we were wrong all along." "And rejecting me helped with that," I said quietly. She winced. "Yes." It was the first time anyone had said it out loud. Margaret left without asking forgiveness and without offering acceptance, but she left something else behind, acknowledgement. It wasn't enough to heal years of exclusion, but it was enough to confirm I hadn't imagined it. More visits followed over the next few weeks. Quiet ones, careful ones. Not apologies exactly, but conversations that circled closer to the truth than ever before. Each person seemed to be testing the ground, seeing whether it would hold if they stepped too close to accountability. Eleanor waited the longest. When she finally called, her voice was steady, but it lacked its usual authority. She asked me to come over. Just the two of us. The house felt heavier than before. Without the buffer of others, Eleanor seemed smaller somehow, older. She motioned for me to sit, then surprised me by sitting across from me instead of at the head of the room. "I built this family on order," she said slowly, "on control, because chaos destroys people." She looked up at me, or so I believed. I didn't interrupt. "When Daniel's fat." "Her made his choices," she continued. "I chose silence. I chose to protect what was left." I told myself it was strength. Her lips tightened. But it was fear. Hearing her say that felt surreal. This was the woman who had measured everyone, dismissed weakness, and demanded loyalty above all else. And now she was admitting that her foundation was built on avoidance. "I thought if we ignored the past, it would stop mattering," she said. "Then you came along, and Daniel changed. He questioned things. He softened." Her eyes met mine, and I blamed you. I let the words settle between us. "Blame is easier than reflection," I said. She nodded once. Yes, what she didn't say was sorry, but she didn't deny anything either. For Eleanor, that was progress. She asked what I planned to do with the documents, with the truth. I told her honestly that I didn't know yet, that I wasn't interested in punishment or exposure. Only clarity, only honesty. "You already changed everything," she said quietly. "I didn't," I replied. "I just stopped hiding it." The conversation didn't end with reconciliation. It ended with an uneasy truce. But when I left that house, I felt something loosen in my chest. I hadn't won anything. I hadn't been welcomed. But I had been seen. And sometimes being seen is the first step toward belonging, even if it comes 20 years too late. That night, I realized something else. Daniel hadn't hidden the truth because he doubted me. He hid it because he knew exactly how powerful it was. After that conversation with Eleanor, I thought things might finally settle. Not resolve, but at least stabilize. I underestimated how deeply a buried truth can disturb the ground it rests on. Once exposed to air, it doesn't just sit quietly. Get me out. They were deciding how to protect themselves, and for the first time, I wasn't excluded. They asked me questions, real ones, about Daniel, about what he'd said, about what I thought should happen next. It was unsettling. I had spent years learning how to be invisible. Now I was expected to be present. I noticed something else, too. When people lose control of the narrative, they start revealing pieces of themselves they didn't mean to. Small confessions slipped out. Regrets surfaced. Old grievances found language. The family wasn't uniting against me anymore. They were fracturing along lines that had existed long before I arrived. One afternoon, Margaret admitted something that stunned me. She told me she'd always suspected Daniel had hidden something, that she'd resented me, not because she thought I'd taken him away, but because she believed I had been chosen to be trusted with something she never was. "I thought you were special," she said bitterly, "and I hated that. I didn't know what to say to that." Honesty has a way of leaving you without the comfort of simple responses. As the review progressed, the tone of the family's interactions shifted again. Now there was fear, not of scandal exactly, but of exposure. Exposure to each other, to the truth that the version of the family they had defended so fiercely was incomplete at best. Eleanor withdrew. She stopped attending meetings, stopped calling. When she did speak, it was brief and clipped. I could tell she was wrestling with something deeper than reputation. Control had been her identity. Losing it left her unmoored. And then came the call I hadn't expected. It was from a lawyer I'd never met. He spoke carefully, choosing his words as if they might detonate. He said the review had uncovered discrepancies that pointed back to Daniel's father, discrepancies that placed Daniel by association in a difficult position. Not legally, morally. They're questioning his intentions, the lawyer said, why he didn't come forward, why he waited. I felt a flare of anger then, sharp and immediate. Daniel had waited because he'd been trying to protect people who didn't deserve that protection, because he believed silence was kinder than truth. And now, in death, he was being judged for it. I defended him, calmly, clearly. I explained what I knew, what he'd written, why he'd hidden the documents. The lawyer listened, but I could tell he was already forming conclusions. After the call ended, I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. I realized that in revealing the truth, I had placed Daniel in a new light, not as the loyal son his family remembered, but as the man who quietly resisted them. And that realization frightened them more than anything else. That night, Eleanor showed up at my door. She looked unlike herself, no makeup, no careful posture, just a woman carrying the weight of too many years spent guarding a lie. She didn't sit. She didn't ask permission. She simply said, "I need to know something." I waited. Did Daniel love us less because of this? Her voice broke on the last word. The question caught me off guard. All this time, I'd assumed Eleanor's fear was about loss of status, of order, but this was different. This was about love, about whether silence had been mistaken for loyalty. "No," I said gently. "He loved you enough to protect you from the truth. He just loved honesty more." She closed her eyes. For a moment, she looked very old. "I thought rejecting you would keep him close," she whispered. "I thought if I made it hard enough, he would choose us." I felt a surge of sadness then. "For all of us." "You didn't lose him because of me," I said. "You lost him because he couldn't live in a lie forever." She nodded slowly. Then she did something I never expected. She apologized. "It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't complete, but it was real," she said. She was sorry for how she treated me, for what she assumed, for what she refused to see. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just acknowledged the harm. When she left, I felt lighter than I had in years. The truth had cost me comfort, but it had given me clarity. And clarity, I was learning, doesn't always bring peace, but it does bring freedom. Daniel had hidden the note to protect the people he loved. In the end, it protected something else too. My right to finally be known. Once the apology was spoken, nothing snapped back into place the way people like to imagine it does. There was no sudden warmth, no family dinners filled with laughter, no sense that the past had been erased. What happened instead was quieter and more unsettling. The old rules stopped working, and no one knew what to replace them with. The family had spent decades operating on assumptions that no longer held. Assumptions about loyalty, about silence, about who deserved to know the truth and who didn't. With those assumptions gone, even simple interactions felt uncertain. Every conversation now carried the weight of what had been avoided for years. I noticed how often people hesitated before speaking, how they chose their words carefully, as if afraid of triggering another collapse. The ease they once had with each other was gone, replaced by a fragile politeness. It was the cost of honesty, and it was being paid unevenly. For me, the shift was disorienting. I had spent so long bracing myself for rejection that I didn't know how to exist in a space where I wasn't actively being pushed away. I caught myself waiting for the familiar sting, the subtle dismissal, the reminder that I was tolerated at best. When it didn't come, I felt exposed instead of relieved. Daniel's absence felt sharper during this time. There were moments when I wished he were here to explain himself, to guide the process, to mediate between the parts of his family that were now rubbing painfully against each other. Then I remembered his letter, the way he had entrusted me with this choy, precisely because he knew he wouldn't be there to soften its impact. The review moved forward steadily. Each week brought new requests for clarification, new meetings, new reminders that the past doesn't stay buried just because people agree not to talk about it. Some of the findings confirmed what the documents had already suggested. Others revealed complications Daniel himself might not have fully understood. The truth, it turned out, was not a single clean line, but a tangled web of decisions, compromises, and self-protection. I was asked to attend a formal session where conclusions would be presented. The idea made my stomach tighten. This was no longer just about family dynamics. It was about record, about accountability, about what would be written down as fact long after emotions had faded. The room was sterile and impersonal. Long table, neutral walls, people who had no history with us but would shape how that history was interpreted. I sat quietly, listening as Daniel's father's actions were dissected in measured tones. No anger, no sympathy, just analysis. When Daniel's name came up, I felt something twist inside me. He was described as cautious, strategic, reluctant to escalate, someone who had known more than he admitted but less than he feared. The assessment was fair, but it felt incomplete. It lacked the humanity of a man who had loved deeply and chosen silence, not out of cowardice, but out of misplaced hope. When I was asked to speak, I surprised myself by doing so calmly. I talked about Daniel's character, his values, the conflict between his loyalty to family and his commitment to truth. I didn't defend his silence. I explained it. There's a difference. Afterward, one of the reviewers approached me privately. "He trusted you," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied, and that trust mattered. When I left the building, the air felt colder than it should have. I realized then that this process was nearing its end, and with it, the version of the family that had defined my adult life. Whatever came next would be built on different ground. Eleanor called that evening. Her voice was quieter than usual. "They're recommending changes," she said. "Corrections, public ones." I closed my eyes. "Are you surprised?" "No," she admitted. "Just tired." That word stayed with me. Tired. It described more than exhaustion. It described the fatigue of maintaining a version of reality that requires constant effort to sustain. I understood that fatigue intimately. In the days that followed, the family faced decisions they had never anticipated making together. Statements, admissions, revisions to records that had been treated as immutable. Each choice felt like a loss to someone and a relief to someone else. There was no outcome that satisfied everyone. I was consulted often, but I didn't lead. This wasn't my reckoning to manage. It was theirs. My role was simply to be present, to refuse invisibility, to insist on clarity where it was offered. One evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, I realized how much had changed inside me. The old urge to shrink, to smooth things over, to make myself smaller for the sake of harmony had faded. In its place was something steadier, not anger, not pride, just certainty. I thought of the woman I had been when I first married Daniel, eager, hopeful, willing to believe that love would naturally lead to belonging. I didn't blame her for that belief, but I no longer needed it. Belonging, I was learning, is not granted by proximity or endurance. It's created through honesty, even when honesty disrupts comfort. When the final recommendations were issued, they came with consequences. Not dramatic ones, but lasting ones. Reputations shifted. Stories changed. The family name no longer rested on unquestioned authority. It rested on transparency, whether they liked it or not. Eleanor invited me over one last time before everything went public. We sat across from each other, not as adversaries, not quite as allies either. Just two women shaped by the same man in different ways. I don't expect you to stay connected to us, she said. Not after this. I don't know yet, I answered honestly. She nodded. I wish I had seen you sooner. I didn't respond. Some wishes arrived too late to be useful. When I left her house that night, I felt something close to closure. Not because everything had been resolved, but because nothing was hidden anymore. Daniel's note had done what it was meant to do. It had forced the truth into the open and left the rest to choice. For 20 years, my husband's family had rejected me without fully understanding why. Now they were learning what rejection really costs. Once the recommendations became public, the family's world shifted in ways they couldn't control. It wasn't dramatic in the way scandals are portrayed on television. There were no headlines screaming betrayal, no crowds gathering at gates. Instead, there was a quiet, irreversible change in how people spoke, how they remembered, how they explained the past to those who asked. Silence was no longer an option, and for a family built on careful omission, that was devastating. I noticed it first in small things. Invitations that used to arrive automatically now came with hesitation, if they came at all. Conversations that once revolved around shared pride now stalled, unsure of what tone to take. The family wasn't being shunned exactly, but they were no longer insulated. People asked questions. People remembered inconsistencies. People noticed, and through it all, they noticed me not as an accessory, not as the woman who didn't quite belong, but as the one who had known, the one Daniel trusted. That shift was uncomfortable for everyone, including me. I hadn't sought recognition. I had sought clarity. But clarity has a way of recasting roles, whether you want it to or not. Margaret called one afternoon, her voice tight. They keep asking me, W. Hi, Daniel never spoke up, she said. Why he didn't fight. I thought of Daniel's quiet strength, the way he believed in choosing battles carefully, because he thought protecting people was more important than proving a point, I said. There was a pause. Do you think he was wrong? I considered the question carefully. I think he was human. That answer didn't satisfy her, but it was the only honest one I had. As weeks turned into months, the family began to fracture in more visible ways. Old alliances dissolved. New ones formed, tentative and unstable. Some members clung desperately to the past, insisting the truth had been exaggerated, that mistakes were being unfairly magnified. Others leaned into accountability, eager to distance themselves from decisions they hadn't made but had benefited from. Eleanor withdrew further from public life. When I did see her, she looked smaller, not physically, but in presence. Authority that once filled every room now struggled to assert itself. She had built her identity on being the keeper of order, and now that order had been exposed as selective. She didn't know who she was without it. One evening, she asked to meet me for dinner, just the two of us, at a quiet restaurant far from familiar territory. I hesitated, then agreed. She arrived early and stood when she saw me, a gesture that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared history pressing down between us. I've been thinking about rejection, she said suddenly, about how easily it becomes habit. I listened. When you first joined our family, she continued, I told myself I was protecting us, protecting Daniel. But the truth is, I was protecting a version of myself that couldn't tolerate being wrong. Her honesty startled me. This was not the woman I had known for years. I convinced myself you didn't belong, she said, because if you did, then everything I believed about loyalty and sacrifice would have had to change. I felt a tightness in my chest, not anger, but recognition. It takes courage to say that, I said. She shook her head. It takes exhaustion. We ate quietly after that. No confrontation, no reconciliation, just two people acknowledging a truth that could no longer be avoided. When we parted, she touched my arm briefly. E'en simpler had I stayed silent. I always answered the same way. Silence had never made my life simpler. It had only made it smaller. Daniel's note had given me a choice, but it had also given me permission. Permission to stop shrinking. Permission to stop waiting for acceptance that came with conditions. Permission to stand in the truth, even when it unsettled everyone around me. As the family continued to adapt, I saw something else emerge. Younger members began asking questions earlier, challenging narratives sooner, refusing to inherit silence as virtue. The change was subtle, but it was there. And I realized then that Daniel's impact extended further than he ever allowed himself to see. One afternoon, I visited his grave alone. I told him about everything, the arguments, the admissions, the shifts. I told him about Eleanor's apology, incomplete but sincere. I told him about Margaret's questions and the way the family had begun to fracture and reform in unexpected ways. I used your letter, I said quietly. I hope that's okay. The wind moved gently through the trees. I felt no guilt, no doubt, only gratitude. He had trusted me, and I had honored that trust in the only way that felt true. As I left, I understood something that had taken me years to learn. Belonging is not about being chosen by others. It's about choosing yourself again and again, even when it costs you comfort. Daniel's family had rejected me for years because my presence threatened their carefully constructed reality. In the end, it wasn't my persistence that changed anything. It was the truth he left behind. With distance came perspective. Stepping back from Daniel's family didn't feel like abandonment anymore. It felt like relief. Not the kind that arrives suddenly, but the slow release of a tension you didn't realize you were carrying every day. I stopped measuring my actions by how they might be perceived. I stopped rehearsing conversations that no longer needed to happen. In the quiet that followed, I began to hear my own thoughts more clearly. Life reorganized itself around simpler rhythms. Mornings without anxiety, evenings without obligation. I filled my space with things that felt like mine again. Books Daniel had loved. Music we used to play on Sunday mornings, objects that carried memory without expectation. Grief softened into something gentler, something that didn't demand constant attention but remained present, like a familiar ache. The family, meanwhile, continued to adjust. I heard updates indirectly, not through calls meant for me, but through mutual acquaintances, through conversations that reached me without intention. Eleanor had stepped down from several roles she once held tightly. Margaret had taken on responsibilities she'd previously avoided. The structure shifted, and with it, the balance of power. The truth had not destroyed them, but it had forced them to grow in directions they hadn't chosen. One evening, I received a message for a cousin I barely knew. She thanked me. No explanation, just gratitude. Later, I learned that the review had opened doors for her to ask questions she'd been silenced for years. Questions about fairness, about legacy, about who benefits when stories are edited to preserve comfort. I hadn't anticipated that kind of impact. I hadn't intended it, but I didn't reject it either. Daniel's absence still lingered in unexpected moments. I would reach for my phone to tell him something trivial. A small victory, a frustration. Then I'd remember. Those moments hurt, but they no longer broke me. Instead, they reminded me of how deeply he had known me, how carefully he had planned for a future he wouldn't see. I began volunteering again, something I'd abandoned during the years of tension. Helping others grounded me. It reminded me that belonging doesn't have to be earned through endurance. Sometimes it grows naturally when expectations are replaced with mutual respect. I met people who didn't know my past, didn't care about my role in a family unraveling. With them, I was simply myself. One afternoon, I received a letter forwarded from the family home, Eleanor's handwriting unmistakable. I hesitated before opening it, surprised by the flicker of emotion that still surfaced at the sight of her name. Inside, the note was brief. She thanked me for my discretion, for not turning the truth into spectacle, for allowing the family to confront its past without public humiliation. At the bottom, she added something unexpected. She said Daniel would have been proud. I sat with that sentence for a long time. Pride had been such a loaded concept in their world, tied to appearance and obedience. To hear it used differently, quietly, without condition, felt significant. Not redemptive, but honest. As seasons changed, so did my understanding of what had happened. I no longer saw the years of rejection as wasted time. They had taught me patience, yes, but also resilience. They had sharpened my awareness of subtle harm, of the ways people maintain power through silence. That awareness was something I carried forward, not as armor, but as insight. Occasionally, someone would ask if I missed being part of the family. The question always caught me off guard. I missed Daniel, always. But the family itself? What I missed was the idea of belonging without conditions. The reality had never matched that idea. One evening, as I sorted through old photographs, I found one from early in our marriage. Daniel and I stood together, smiling, slightly unsure of the future but hopeful. In the background, his family watched. The distance between us was visible even then. I hadn't noticed it at the time. Love has a way of narrowing your focus. I placed the photo back in its envelope and felt a quiet acceptance settle in. That chapter of my life had been shaped by forces larger than me, forces rooted in fear and control. I had done what I could within those constraints. When the opportunity to choose differently arrived, I took it. Daniel's note had been a bridge between silence and truth. It had connected past decisions to present consequences. And in doing so, it had given me something invaluable. Agency. I didn't need the family's approval anymore. I didn't need their acceptance to validate my place in Daniel's life. That place had always been secure, written not in public gestures, but in private trust. As time went on, the story became less about what they had done to me and more about what I had done for myself. I had honored Daniel's truth. I had honored my own. And in that alignment, I found peace. Some endings are not marked by reconciliation or forgiveness. They are marked by clarity, by the quiet understanding that you have done what you could, and what remains is not yours to carry. Daniel hid the note for 20 years, hoping to protect everyone involved. In the end, it protected something far more important, the truth. By the time autumn arrived, the story had settled into its final shape. Not finished exactly, but complete enough that it no longer demanded my constant attention. The truth had been acknowledged, recorded, and absorbed into the family's history. It no longer hovered like a threat. It simply existed, immutable and unignored. I realized then how much energy silence consumes. Keeping a secret alive requires constant vigilance. Someone always has to remember what not to say, who not to trust, which version of events to repeat. Once the truth was out, that labor disappeared. People still disagreed, still felt resentment or regret, but the exhausting work of pretending was over. I noticed the change most clearly when I ran into Margaret unexpectedly at a bookstore. We hadn't spoken in weeks. She looked surprised, then relieved. We talked about ordinary things at first, the kind of conversation people have when they don't know where the emotional boundaries lie anymore. Then she said something that stayed with me. "I don't feel like I'm guarding anything now," she said. I didn't realize how tired I was. I nodded. None of us did. The family's younger generation began approaching me in quiet ways, messages asking for context, for clarification, for stories about Daniel that weren't filtered through the family lens. I shared what felt appropriate. I didn't editorialize. I let Daniel be seen as he was, kind, conflicted, thoughtful, imperfect. They listened closely, not because I demanded it, but because they sensed there was something valuable in unpolished truth. One afternoon, I was invited to attend a small gathering at the family home. Not a formal event, just coffee. The invitation surprised me. I hesitated, then accepted, more curious than hopeful. The house felt different, lighter. Not because everything was resolved, but because nothing was being hidden. People spoke more cautiously, but also more honestly. I wasn't treated as an outsider anymore, but neither was I placed on a pedestal. I was simply included. Eleanor greeted me at the door. She looked composed, but there was humility in her posture that hadn't been there before. We exchanged a brief embrace, awkward, restrained, but real. It wasn't forgiveness, it was recognition. During the gathering, no one avoided Daniel's name. They spoke of him openly, not just as a son or brother, but as a man who had made difficult choices. Some praised him, some questioned him. No one erased him. That mattered. As I drove home later, I felt a quiet sense of closure settle in. Not relief, not triumph, just acceptance. The family's rejection had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. Their acknowledgement, however imperfect, felt like a full stop at the end of a long sentence. In the weeks that followed, I turned my attention outward. I began speaking at small community events about grief, about truth, about the cost of silence. I didn't share names or details, I shared lessons. People listened, not because the story was dramatic, but because it was familiar. Everyone carries something they've been taught not to say. I realized then that Daniel's note had never been just for me. It was a catalyst, a reminder that truth deferred does not disappear. It waits, it gathers weight, and when it finally emerges, it reshapes everything it touches. One evening, as I sorted through old papers, I came across the envelope again, the original letter. I reread it slowly, noticing things I hadn't before, the care in his phrasing, the restraint, the trust. Daniel had known that truth once revealed could not be controlled, and he had chosen me anyway. That choice humbled me. I thought about the woman I had been at the beginning of this journey, eager to belong, willing to endure discomfort in exchange for conditional acceptance. I didn't judge her. She had loved deeply, but I no longer needed to be her. Belonging, I had learned, is not a gift others bestow when you prove yourself worthy. It is a state you claim when you stop negotiating your dignity. As the year drew to a close, Eleanor sent me a holiday card. Simple, unadorned. Inside, she wrote a single sentence: "Thank you for honoring Daniel." I placed the card beside his photograph and felt a quiet peace settle in. The story had come full circle, from rejection to revelation, from silence to truth, from isolation to agency. Daniel hid the note for 20 years because he feared what truth might cost. What it gave us instead was clarity. And clarity, once found, is impossible to lose. Time has a way of settling things into perspective, smoothing the sharpest edges without erasing what caused them. By the time winter arrived, the noise around Daniel's family had quieted, replaced by something steadier and more honest. The truth no longer felt like a disruption. It had become part of the landscape, something people navigated instead of avoided. I found myself thinking less about what had been taken from me and more about hat had been returned. For years, I had given energy to earning approval that was never meant to be given freely. I had mistaken endurance for strength and silence for grace. Letting go of those beliefs felt like stepping into a room I hadn't known existed, spacious, calm, and entirely my own. I began to notice how differently I moved through the world now. I spoke without rehearsing. I listened without bracing for judgment. When people disagreed with me, it no longer felt like a threat to my place. Disagreement didn't equal rejection anymore. That shift alone was transformative. Daniel's family continued adjusting in their own imperfect ways. Some members embraced transparency with surprising openness. Others kept a careful distance, still unsure how to engage without the old rules. I learned to accept both responses without internalizing them. Their process was theirs. Mine was mine. One afternoon, Margaret asked if I would meet her for coffee. We sat across from each other, steam rising from our cups, the familiarity between us tinged with something new. She spoke about the pressure she had always felt to conform, to protect the family image even when it cost her honesty. She admitted that watching me refuse invisibility had forced her to question her own silence. I thought strength meant holding things together at any cost, she said. Now I'm not so sure. I smiled gently. Strength can also mean letting things change. That conversation stayed with me. It reminded me that the ripple effects of truth are rarely immediate or dramatic. They move quietly, altering choices, reframing values, shifting futures in ways no one can fully predict. As the months passed, I made deliberate choices about my own life. I downsized my apartment, shedding objects that no longer served me. I traveled alone for the first time, discovering how empowering solitude can be when it's chosen rather than imposed. I invested time in friendships that had waited patiently while I navigated family tension that wasn't even mine by blood. Every so often, someone would ask how I felt about Daniel now, whether learning the full scope of his silence had changed my love for him. The answer surprised even me. If anything, I loved him more clearly. Understanding his fear didn't diminish him, it humanized him. He hadn't been perfect, he hadn't been brave in all the ways he wished he were, but he had trusted me with the truth when it mattered most. That trust, given quietly and without demand, felt like the purest form of love. On the anniversary of his death, I visited his grave again. This time, I didn't bring questions or explanations. I brought gratitude. I told him about the peace I had found, about the way his note had altered not just my relationship with his family, but my relationship with myself. I'm okay, I said aloud, and I meant it. The family sent flowers that day, a simple arrangement, no card, no expectations attached. It felt appropriate. Respect W. Without obligation, a recognition of shared history without ownership over my future. Later that evening, I sat by my window watching the city lights flicker on. I thought about how long I had believed belonging was something to be earned through patience and compromise. How much of myself I had folded away to fit into spaces that were never designed to hold me fully. The truth Daniel hid for 20 years hadn't just exposed a family secret. It had exposed a pattern, one that extended beyond that household, beyond that story. A pattern of people being asked to endure quietly in the name of harmony, while discomfort is redistributed unevenly. Breaking that pattern wasn't loud. It didn't require confrontation or cruelty. It required presence, clarity, a refusal to disappear. I understood now why Daniel had chosen to write the note instead of speaking openly. He had known that truth doesn't always land where you expect it to, that it needs time, context, and the right hands to carry it forward. He had trusted me to be those hands. That trust reshaped everything. As winter gave way to spring, I felt ready for whatever came next, not because all wounds had healed, but because I no longer carried the burden of hiding. My story was mine now, intact and unedited. Daniel's family had rejected me for years without fully understanding why. When the truth emerged, it didn't just change how they saw me, it changed how I saw myself. And that, I realized, was the real inheritance he left behind. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It never does. It crept in quietly, one longer evening at a time, one morning where the air felt lighter than the day before. I noticed it first in myself. I woke up without the familiar weight in my chest. I made plans without calculating who they might upset. I realized that for the first time in years, my life was no longer arranged around anticipation of rejection. I hadn't expected healing to feel so ordinary. There were still moments when the past resurfaced. A song Daniel loved playing in a cafe, a phrase someone used that echoed his voice. Grief doesn't disappear, it changes shape, but it no longer controlled me. It walked beside me, quieter now, less demanding. The family reached out less frequently, and when they did, the tone was different. There were no instructions disguised as invitations, no expectations hidden behind politeness. When Eleanor called, it was brief and purposeful. Updates, check-ins, nothing more, nothing less. It felt respectful, and that was new. One afternoon, I received a package in the mail. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. Inside was a small wooden box, carefully wrapped. When I opened it, I found a watch that had belonged to Daniel's father. I had seen it once, years ago, mentioned in passing as something that had been lost. Tucked beneath it was a note from Eleanor, just a few lines. She wrote that the watch had been part of the old dispute, one of the items whose disappearance had fueled resentment and blame. She wrote that returning it to me felt right, that it belonged with Daniel's things, that some objects carry too much history to remain hidden. I sat with that box for a long time. It wasn't about ownership, it was about acknowledgement. The family was no longer trying to control where the story ended. They were letting it rest where it belonged. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't feel rushed to. That urgency, that need to manage other people's emotions had faded. When I did write back, I thanked her simply and honestly. No explanations, no conditions. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how often people asked me about the past in hushed tones, as if expecting bitterness. They seemed surprised when I spoke without anger. Truth doesn't require rage to be powerful. Sometimes calm is far more unsettling. I began mentoring a young woman through a community program, someone navigating her own complicated family dynamics. She listened intently as I spoke about boundaries, about the cost of silence, about choosing clarity over comfort. She told me later that it was the first time she'd heard someone articulate what she'd been feeling but couldn't name. That conversation stayed with me. It reminded me that stories don't end when they stop hurting. They end when they start teaching. Daniel's note had done that for me. It had taught me the difference between loyalty and erasure, between love and obligation, between peace and avoidance. Those lessons didn't just apply to his family. They applied everywhere. One evening, while sorting through paperwork, I came across the original documents again. I considered what to do with them now that the review was complete. They no longer needed to be hidden or presented. They had served their purpose. I made copies, stored securely, and then placed the originals in a sealed envelope, not to bury them again, but to mark their place in history. Some truths need to be accessible, others need to be preserved with care. The difference lies in intention. As the year progressed, the family's internal dynamics continued to evolve without my involvement. I heard that Eleanor had begun attending counseling, something she would have scoffed at years earlier, that Margaret had changed how she parented, encouraging openness over obedience. These weren't grand transformations, but they mattered. I didn't take credit for them. Change is never the result of one person's actions alone, but I allowed myself to acknowledge that the truth had played a role. On the anniversary of Daniel's birthday, I did something I'd never done before. I invited a few people who had known him in different parts of his life, friends from college, colleagues, neighbors. We shared stories, laughed, remembered him fully, not just as a son or husband, but as a whole person. It felt right as the evening wound down. One of his old friends pulled me aside. "He always knew you were stronger than you thought," he said. He used to talk about that. I smiled, feeling the familiar ache of missing him. I wish he'd told me more often. "Maybe this was his way," the friend replied. That thought stayed with me long after the guests left. I understood now that Daniel's legacy wasn't just the truth he hid or the note he left behind. It was the courage he quietly cultivated in others, the willingness to question inherited narratives, the trust placed in the right hands at the right time. As summer approached, I felt something settle into place. Not closure, but continuity. My life wasn't defined by what I'd endured or revealed. It was defined by what I chose next. Daniel's family had rejected me for years because my presence challenged their version of reality. When that reality finally shifted, I didn't rush to reclaim a place within it. I built my own, By the time summer arrived, I stopped thinking of my story as something unfinished, not because every question had been answered, but because I no longer needed answers to move forward. There is a quiet strength in that realization, the understanding that clarity doesn't always come from resolution, but from acceptance. I had spent years believing that if I just endured long enough, understanding would follow, that patience would eventually earn warmth, that silence would be rewarded with belonging. What Daniel's note taught me more than anything else was how flawed that belief had been. Endurance without honesty doesn't build bridges, it builds walls. I looked back on my early years with his family differently now. The dinners where my opinions were politely ignored. The celebrations where my role was supportive but peripheral. The moments when I questioned myself instead of questioning the environment. I no longer saw those years as a failure on my part. I saw them as evidence of how deeply people can commit to a narrative that protects them from discomfort. And I forgave myself for staying as long as I did. Forgiveness, I learned, is not about excusing what happened. It's about releasing yourself from the obligation to keep carrying it. I didn't forgive the rejection because it deserved forgiveness. I forgave it because I deserved peace. Daniel's family remained part of my life in a limited, distant way. Holiday messages, occasional updates, mutual respect without intimacy. It was a balance that worked. We no longer tried to be something we weren't. That honesty felt like a small victory in itself. One afternoon, while walking through a park near my home, I realized I hadn't thought about whether I was accepted in a long time. The question had simply disappeared. It no longer shaped my choices or my self-perception. That absence felt like freedom. I thought about Daniel often, but without the heaviness that once accompanied his memory. I remembered his humor, his quiet defiance, his belief that truth, even when delayed, was worth protecting. I understood now that his note wasn't an act of fear. It was an act of faith. Faith that I would know what to do when the time came, and the note didn't force me into confrontation. It didn't demand revenge or exposure. It gave me information and agency, and trusted me to choose integrity over impulse. That trust had changed the course of my life. I began sharing my story more openly, not as a cautionary tale, but as an invitation to question inherited silence, to examine who benefits when certain truths are left unspoken, to recognize when endurance is being mistaken for virtue. People responded in ways I hadn't expected. Some thanked me, some resisted, some saw themselves reflected in pieces of my story and felt uncomfortable. I welcomed all of it. Truth doesn't exist to comfort everyone equally. Looking back, I realized that the family's rejection had never been about me personally. It had been about preservation of power, of image, of a version of history that required silence to survive. My presence, my questions, my existence outside their rules threatened that preservation. Rejection was their defense mechanism, understanding that allowed me to let go of resentment. Resentment requires personalization. Clarity removes that need. I thought of the moment I'd found the envelope with my name on it, the fear, the hesitation, the knowledge that opening it would change everything. I smiled at the memory now. I had been afraid of losing what little connection I had left. What I hadn't realized was that I was about to gain something far more valuable, my voice. The story didn't end with acceptance from Daniel's family. It ended with acceptance from myself, with the understanding that belonging isn't something you negotiate for. It's something you claim by refusing to abandon your truth. Daniel hid the note for 20 years because he hoped to protect everyone. In the end, it protected the one thing that mattered most, the truth that set me free.